So welcome to the first session, Conservation Finance 101. We're going to talk about tools and trends and experience in the room. And I really want to emphasize that last part, experience in the room. You all have a lot to bring and a lot to share. And so we hope to pause and make sure that a lot of that comes in as we move forward. So first, I want to introduce Leigh Whelpton, who is in the far upper right corner of the screen. We also have a number of folks who are joining us virtually. You can't see their faces, but they're here. And so for that reason, we're going to use the microphones. When we do have questions, we will be bringing a microphone around so that the people who are joining virtually and Leigh can hear you when you ask your questions. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Leigh Whelpton.
Sorry, just scrambling to find my mute button, which is usually a little easier to find. How's my audio, Walker?
You sound great. Yeah, thumbs up.
All right, thumbs up, doing all right. Well, welcome everyone, both in person and those joining us virtually. This is the 17th annual, 19th overall, Conservation Finance Boot Camp. As Walker said, I'm Leigh Whelpton. I'm the outgoing executive director of the Conservation Finance Network. Joined in the room, we have our interim executive director, Peter Howell. Can't wait for folks to get to meet him and the rest of the team. We are going to kick off today with a rapid, brief, and partial introduction to some of the tools and strategies we'll be touching on this week, as well as taking stock of some of the depth of experience we have assembled among the attendee cohort there in New Haven. I can't help but backseat drive, so I have it on good intel that the rapid fire introduction started to bring out some of that, but we're going to try and use the next hour to do a little more. Just to note, we have about 45 people signed up to join us for the 7 live stream sessions over the course of the week. And as with any hybrid workshop, we'll do our best to start the live stream sessions promptly at the scheduled time. Maybe you can give us a little grace if we're a couple minutes late coming back from something. And just a couple quick housekeeping items for our remote colleagues that'll run over the course of the week. One, every time we join, please introduce yourself in the chat. We want to get to know you. We also hope to share that with others. So please introduce yourself, name, title, organization, location, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. We'll be keeping your lines muted, cameras off, but please toss your questions into the chat at any point in time. The CFN team, whether my colleagues Julia, Mary, or me, will be monitoring the chat and voicing your questions to the speakers periodically. Also, to those in the room, we on the live stream side can't hear your wonderful questions until you have a microphone in front of you. So if you can just spend 2 seconds pausing before your question, I think so too, if you could share your name and affiliation. We can't see you in the classroom, but if you could share your name and affiliation before you ask a question, it'll really help the live stream participants to get a little context on where your question's coming from or the experience that you're sharing. Other than that, recordings of all the sessions will be made available in the next week or two for all attendees, both virtual and in person. We know a couple people have conflicts this week, so we hope that'll help. So let's jump in, shall we? Everybody here today, both in person and remote, are working in various capacities to craft some type of a solution to a conservation, restoration, or stewardship problem, whether that involves land acquisition, community partnerships, ecotourism recreation projects, biodiversity conservation, greenway development, climate resilience, equitable economic development, you name it. So the aim is really to think about how we're blending tools and incentives to help you and your team find the capital you need for that project or solution. In under an hour, a bit ambitious, Brad, Walker, and I are going to do our best to provide a very brief introduction to the universe of creative funding and financing considerations that we'll be exploring across the week, as well as pausing to hear from in-person attendees who've put them to use. So I guess I should advance. Brad and Walker, we'll see them up at the front of the room in just a minute here. You saw Walker already. And then really the goal today is to share a little bit about conservation finance, our perennial talking point about going for the simplest and easiest money first, touching on elements of project readiness, and then getting into some select sources and uses of funding and financing. First, just a very quick word on the Conservation Finance Network for those who are less familiar with our work. Our fundamental business is really about helping practitioners find the money for projects by building and supporting a community of practice, providing coaching and technical assistance, and increasing capacity, confidence, and connections across the field. We do that in a number of ways. This boot camp is certainly one of our favorite. And I'll just say that across every survey we've ever done of folks who've attended the boot camp, the single greatest thing that has helped people put what they learn into practice is the ability to call someone and get input and advice, whether that's from a peer, an expert, you name it. So for those of you in person this week, really hoping that you make the most of in-person connection and that lingers for many years to come. So Brad, I believe the next 2 slides are over to you.
I'm just going to do it remotely from here. That's all right, Leigh. One of the things that we try to figure out in teaching about conservation finance is, can you offer some relatively simple rubric, but that's useful? And this is one that comes from a report that was done in 2019, published in 2020, about where does the money come from globally for conservation efforts? And you'll see lots of people talk about getting philanthropic funding, and that's currently the smallest global source. The largest source is government grants, largely domestic national governments, but also some foreign aid type funding. Lots of talk about for-profit investment, which I think you're starting to see more, but still pretty small. But any of that for-profit would depend on cash flows from the land in some, whether it's credits or sustainable food or sustainable timber or other sorts of things like that. And we'll talk more about those during our payments for ecosystem services sessions tomorrow. You can go to the next slide, Leigh. So if you think about those 4 major categories of charitable funding, public funding, cash flows, and private debt or equity, and in this source, for those of you who don't know, equity does not mean fairness in this context. It means ownership, ownership of the land, ownership of a company, something like that. Where does it come from? You know, a lot of it comes from savings. A lot of it comes from taxes on income. And some of it comes directly from the sales of goods or services. When to use it? Charitable money often is seen as the best way to start because it's often doesn't require necessarily quite as much from an administrative capacity or a variety of other sorts of preconditions you have to go through before you get to the public grants. And then cash flows. You have to have something that somebody will pay you for. And that often is hard to do from a conservation organization point of view, but certainly not impossible. And then if you're going to try to get private debt or equity, you need to have some way to pay it back. So that takes you back to the cash flows, which again, we'll talk about more tomorrow. You know, a lot of how to find it, obviously it's through your relationships, and that's why we'll keep emphasizing all week. Take advantage of your colleagues who are here, take advantage of the speakers to start building relationships so that if you're in need of funding, you can go to someone and say, okay, who might I talk to, or what would my project fit for this? Because there's an awful lot of tailoring that goes on. And then how to obtain it, you know, meeting donor intent, meeting agency requirements, meeting buyer requirements. And then if you're actually, you have some cash flows, sort of building a track record, how quickly can you go to debt or equity if you haven't been in existence for a while? So there's sort of a valley of death type problem there that can come up, that again, blended financing of some charitable and some government and some other types of private money can help you get across. So anyhow, and then the key takeaways, you know, the problem is the largest current source is government money, but we always know that government money in the form of taxes is much less available or a much smaller pool of capital than the private capital. But the private capital is much harder for conservation type organizations to tap into, although we have colleagues here who are looking to do more of that. And again, please make sure you ask all sorts of questions about that as we go. Leigh, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I think, Brad, relative to your prior slide, we are seeing increases across the board, especially with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Many more millions mobilized for public grants. And I would say, there is somewhat of an explosion of interest, whether that's partly due to corporate buyers looking to put more money into conservation and sustainability, kind of CSR, corporate social responsibility related things. But I would assume, the rules still fit in terms of ease or lack thereof of access. So probably a rather similar type of spread.
Okay, over to you.
All right. So just kind of big picture across everything Brad was just introducing, we define conservation finance as a range of strategies that, in one form or another, generate, manage, and deploy financial resources, or importantly, align incentives to achieve some kind of conservation outcome. And so it's really about how you use other people's money to help address your own problem. By other people's money, we mean public, philanthropic, private, or often blended sources of capital. So the strategies that we're going to get into are really meant to cobble together financial resources for projects, create new conservation products, so to speak, or revenue streams, create more holistic partnerships with other sectors that have aligned interests like health, community resilience, public utilities and infrastructure, et cetera. And Brad, you did a great job just defining funding and financing, money you don't have to pay back, money you do have to pay back, and some mix of the two in blended or layered finance. And just a quick tip in terms of something that has helped guide me over the years. I have always found that the language of finance was invented to intimidate. So my joke is that's how they justify the fees, right? So anytime you're reading about a financial approach, and like me, you start to get a little overwhelmed or intimidated, just remember to kind of see through the jargon and just really try and understand what's at the heart of the model. A couple quick preachy points, if you will, as we wade into an intense week of all things conservation finance. Go for the simplest and easiest money first, relative to what Brad was just talking about. Another point, build the solution from the pain point. So really understand what's the underlying problem that you're trying to solve. We do see a lot of solutions and search for problems in the conservation finance sector. And we found that some of the most effective efforts have a real laser-like focus on what the actual underlying problem is and who's tied to the outcomes, what types of beneficiaries are tied to those outcomes. Also, if you're working with private capital or really any kind of capital, public too, for those who have ever been in charge of managing federal funds, there's no such thing for free lunch. In the case with private capital especially, they don't just expect 100% of their money back, they expect additional returns. Also importantly, someone somewhere must be willing and able to pay for the good or service or program or outcome that you are cooking up. So you need some entity that is willing to pay for the conservation outcome. That could be consumers, corporate entities, utility rate payers, taxpayers, a philanthropic entity, but somebody has to be willing and able to pay. Very importantly, partner. Can't stress this one enough. You do not need to be the expert to get into a really interesting and creative approach to solving a problem. There are many specialists out there that can help you with project design and implementation. This field is growing in spades every day, month, year. And so don't think that you have to have a complete and thorough understanding of all of the ins and outs of a particular project type. But ask around, find somebody who's done it before, potentially partner with that entity or another. And that can really help to get things moving a heck of a lot faster. And then this one didn't even make it on the slides. I just wanted to remember to say it. The best time to talk to funders, the best time to talk to capital providers is when you don't actually need the money. So Brad was talking about this a little bit. Start a dialogue, tend to it, invite a program foundation officer into your meetings to see the work in action. Bring along those partners and allies who can help impress upon the foundation that they should support your work. All right, so let's jump in a little further. This is our attempt to describe some of the general buckets of strategy behind a lot of the types of projects that you may come into contact with. So we've bucketed these as conservation-oriented real asset investment, which is a mouthful, but really it's meant to encompass that buy, protect, release, and sell model for forest, farm, and ranch land conservation. Environmental credit markets, which we'll delve deeply into tomorrow morning, that can be regulated or voluntary. Payment for the ecosystem services, carbon, wetlands, et cetera. Commodity supply chain improvements, we're seeing a lot of this emerging on scene, especially in the regenerative agriculture movement. So engaging up and downstream in the supply chain for better practices, better products, better sustainability, better soil health. Cost savings and risk reduction. This one's probably the fuzziest of the categories, a bit of a catch-all, but really meant to cover a range of strategies, whether they're coming from the insurance sector, whether we're thinking about green infrastructure approaches, outcomes-based models, those things that either provide a cost savings relative to status quo, or that help to shift risk in a particular project model, ecosystem, community. Newer leverage funding. This one is really a little bit about creativity. Again, a lot of different strategies under this umbrella, but stretching public funds, potentially borrowing money to bridge the time that it takes for a certain funding source to mobilize and come through for your project. Natural resource damage assessments in some cases. These can also be surcharges or consumer-driven certification programs, things like that. And if you're like me, this is all well and fine, but you need it to get tangible pretty quickly. So just a couple quick examples. We've got some represented in the room, so please talk to your colleagues to learn a little bit more about their approach. But conservation-oriented real asset investment. So we have Lime Timber in the room this week. Ask them about a very large timber acquisition in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that has a whole lot of different strategies and components tied in under their model. And David Hoffer, who's following this presentation with the Principles of Finance session, he'll be able to share a little bit more about that transaction model. Environmental credit markets, that can be compliance, that can be voluntary. We have the Climate Trust represented in the boot camp this week. And everything I know about the avoided conversion of soil carbon credits, I've learned from the Climate Trust and those colleagues. They're also involved in improved forest management projects. Commodity supply chain improvements. For those who've been following along, Farmers Business Network and the Environmental Defense Fund launched a pilot loan program where you get a discount on the rate of your farm operating loan for implementing a number of best management practices related to climate smart and soil health agricultural management practices. Cost savings and risk reduction. I'm an Ohioan. I love this model. Wayne National Forest, there was an opportunity to develop mountain biking trail infrastructure, but the towns that would benefit from increased visitation and tourism didn't necessarily have the cash to put at risk to develop that project, not knowing if it would come through. The architect of this project, Seth Brown of Quantified Ventures, will be presenting on Thursday. So you can ask him for many more details about this one, definitely his baby. But the gist of it is mobilizing outside capital resources to do the upfront investment into an 88-mile mountain biking trail system in the South Central Appalachian, Ohio. And then the towns formed a council of government, which will pay back that upfront investment at a certain time triggered count of how much or how little visitation was increased. And then newer leveraged funding. The Conservation Finance Network had a very small role in this one, but Ski Santa Fe also Snowshoe Mountain Resort in West Virginia, a similar example. Both of those resorts signed up with the National Forest Foundation to put a small surcharge on all season lift tickets. Those funds are collected and they go to National Forest beneficial projects. Brad, Walker, pause me at any point in time to kind of take the pulse of the room. I can't see folks, so I don't know if they're all dozing off or how we're doing.
For folks in the room, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll see you. I'll stop Leigh, and then we'll get your question into the mix. Brad, too.
Perfect.
Yeah, maybe I should go on the other side of the room. And then for those who are listening in, if you put your question into the chat, Mary will see it and she'll bring it into the mix.
Perfect. All right, let's keep rolling because I know time is short. Okay, my slides will advance here in a second, I hope. There we go. So this table trades a little bit, overlaps a little with Brad's earlier table. It's really meant to reinforce that point, going for the easiest, simplest, and easiest money first. So meant to help think through the different types of tools and money out there. If you think about those things starting at the left end, tax benefits have been the bread and butter of land and resource conservation for 40 years plus at this point. You donate a property or conservation easement, you get a tax deduction. Also onto individual giving, gifts and grants, whether from individuals, foundations, municipal, state, federal agencies. In some cases, and I'm assuming some folks in the room are quite involved in actually managing land or property to produce income for their organization or firm. And then moving to the further on the right, you start to get into sources of debt, tax credits, equity investment. The amount of money out there does get larger. That's represented by this little wedge that we have under the table here. But so too does the cost and complexity. The money itself gets more and more expensive to use. So this is just kind of meant to help, especially as folks think about jumping into a partnership with, say, a private equity firm. Really just understanding what the difference is between different sources of capital and their uses and expectations for what comes out of them. Brad, anything to add here?
Not from me, but Peter Stein has his hand up, so get ready.
Oh boy.
Peter, you should introduce yourself too.
So as Brad indicated, I actually am Peter Stein, and with David and Lindsay get to work at Lime Timber Company. But I'm also one of the co-founders of the Conservation Finance Network. And particularly for US-based groups, under individual giving, a growing component that people should check out are donor-advised funds at community foundations and at the commercial donor-advised fund holders like Vanguard and Fidelity, and there are quite a few others. There's a great example in Vermont where Vermont Land Trust worked with the Vermont Community Foundation to access about half a dozen donor-advised funds for interim financing for buy, restrict, sell farmland projects. And the Northern Forest Center is doing a similar thing as well. So it's just one tiny thing I would like to add under the individual giving box.
Hi, Peter. Sorry to miss you.
And Leigh, before you go on, I just wanted to make sure folks know the slides that Leigh is showing and also the slides from future presentations will be available. So please take your notes, snap a photo if you want. Also, you don't have to because you will get the presentations. Thanks.
Thanks, Walker. All right, so we're going to blast through project readiness real quick, just to say that for anyone who's considering something, especially a departure from some of what their organization has previously done, it's just absolutely critical that you have different elements of both operational and financial readiness in place, that you've done your due diligence on the project, that you have a really thorough way of vetting a particular type of project. You have good governance in place, you have a good support team, your development team has signed off on any relevant strategy components, things like that. And then from a back of the house perspective, does the project partner team understand the essential parts of the transaction? Are your finance staff, processes, and bookkeeping systems set up to responsibly manage different types of capital? there's kind of a cautionary tale of a do not proceed if you don't have the back of the house support really ready and in place to manage the type of money that you're bringing through the door. All right, so select sources and uses. And this is where we really also want to gauge a little bit more of that experience in the room. So Brad and Walker are going to help me a little bit since I can't see any of you. But thinking about voluntary surcharges, for example, a small surcharge added to a bill or a transaction, many examples of this across the country, whether it's, at the register, a small 1% charge being added to, say, if you're in Colorado, especially in Crested Butte, being added to, the sale of your ski jacket or something like that. We're not going to read through all of the text on these slides because we only have about 30 minutes left together in this session. Plus a lot of this experience, I think, will come out. Walker, Brad, anyone in the room have any organizations experimented with a type of a voluntary surcharge or refundable tariff program?
Just raise your hand, please. I see one hand go up, two.
Maybe we can get like a one sentence, what you did.
Hang on just a sec. Do you mind?
So did 2 voluntary surcharges, one in the water space, a surcharge on sales of water bottles in developed markets, offsetting costs of access to clean water in developing markets. And then the second, which is more land use oriented, working in Hawaii, essentially covering the upfront cost of reforestation through a per night, per bed surcharge on with a number of hotel groups. That then went into the implementing team on the forestry project. That team then generated cash flows that could be recycled. So, through monetizing some of the ecosystem services. So it combined a couple of the features.
And only because we cannot see you, speaker, can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, Harry Guinness at New Leaf.
Perfect. Thank you, Harry. All right. So let's keep rolling, shall we?
Did you want the second one as well or no?
Sure. Again, I can't see hands raised, Brad, so you'll have to, give me my marching instructions.
Hi, this is Laura from the World Resources Institute. We actually have supported a project in Mexico in the city of Jalapa, where a voluntary surcharge was added to the water bill for customers, totally voluntary. It was opt out, right? And the funds that were collected via that surcharge were used for nature-based solutions at the watershed level, and then at the city level, also green infrastructure, just to kind of develop the infrastructure needed to have a more reliable access to water in the city. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd be interested, we don't need to get into it now, but the rumor that we've heard is when you design one of these programs and you design it as an opt-out versus an opt-in, when you ask people to opt in, you get about 4% of people who opt in, meaning like, I'm sure everyone's been to the grocery store, do you want to add $1 percentage to support a certain charity? As opposed to when it's added to your bill and then you have to actually ask to be opted out of it. We hear that there's about a 4% opt out, meaning 96% participation. That's a little hearsay at this point, but just a little fun note to throw in here. All right, let's keep moving. My slides are a little slow to advance, sorry folks. So water funds, so a slightly different type of kind of crowding various sources of money. We're lucky to be joined tomorrow by one of the principals behind the Sebago Clean Waters. Spencer Meyer will also be in the room this week, who was one of the architects of this project. But effectively, it's a form of pooled philanthropy, which a variety of beneficiaries and donors can crowd into, which can support some components of land management. Since you're going to hear about Sebago tomorrow, I'll speak to the Rio Grande Water Fund. Last we checked, this is a couple years stale now, but approximately 77 entities, including the local water utility, who were contributing annually to the tune of about $1 million a year well, I guess the water utility was putting in about that much a year to do on-forest fuels treatment from mechanical thinning and prescribed burning to help reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire on the Santa Fe National Forest near the city of Santa Fe. Not sure if anybody in the room has had experience with water funds, but we ought to check.
Any hands on water funds? Yeah, got at least one. Hang on, Leigh. Quick introduction.
Hi, Jennifer Dipley with Culp & Kelly. We've worked with a few different water funds around the West, Rio Grande one, tangentially, and also are putting together a few around Central and Southern Arizona.
Jen, hi Jen, also should have known. Excellent. All right, so we can keep going. Corporate social responsibility. We used to have a slide about corporate philanthropy. We've changed that with corporate social responsibility. So I'm sure folks are familiar with a lot of CSR efforts as they go, but how businesses manage social, environmental, and economic side of their operations. I would say in a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of corporate partners that previously provided philanthropy, whether it's due to internal or external pressures, are shifting more to partnerships that require quote unquote key performance indicators so that they can report out to those stakeholders on improvements that they may have made. I'll share one quick example, which is Coca-Cola putting in funding to the National Forest Foundation for the Carson National Forest, 3 different projects there tied to some of Coca-Cola's water conservation efforts. I'm sure that there are folks in the room who have been part of some kind of a corporate partnership tied to key performance indicators.
Any hands for that one? Quick, what? A repeat. Hang on just a second.
Related to some of those water funds, we've worked with some corporations meeting their sustainability goals around water with specific water offsets sometimes more general. Technology companies around the West has been a big one lately.
And again, that's Jen with Culp & Kelly LLP. I could just tell. But Jen, I wonder if you might say if there's anything that really spoke to or sparked why a corporate entity was participating.
Good question. I've seen much more pressure on the energy side. In a former life, I was at a state utilities commission, and there were a lot of companies getting more pressure to reduce their carbon footprint. So we're looking for pretty quantifiable things to invest in to show an offset. Water is starting to get there. In many places where I'm working around the West, it's kind of companies that are not trying to meet any certain regulatory obligation, but just trying to show that kind of meeting their corporate environmental sustainability goals and looking for some level of a quantified offset to their production.
Very much tied to that social license to operate from the sound of it.
One more raise hand.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Natasha Collins with the World Resources Institute. We work with a lot of different partners, including Bonneville Environmental Foundation on a lot of this corporate social responsibility and generating volumetric water benefits. And we're developing kind of a new guidance for that related to the methodology for accounting for that. And I would say similar to what Jen mentioned in terms of motivations, and then oftentimes like for example, with Coca-Cola, their bottling facilities, I think they're really interested in watersheds near bottling facilities or maybe tech companies that have data centers. So really looking at kind of local impact and water usage for the companies funding these projects.
Yeah, that certainly tracks with what we've seen Facebook data centers, for example, back when the Conservation Finance Network was part of the Conservation Fund. All right, let's keep moving on here.
Leigh, we have a couple more hands.
Oh,
Do
all
you
right.
have time to hear from them?
Sure. We should then probably keep moving, maybe one more.
Okay.
This one kind of hit a little close to home because Coca-Cola is planning on building a I'm Zach Radmer, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Coca-Cola is planning on building a bottling plant on top of critical habitat for one of our endangered species. I'm wondering if you have any tips about working with companies and how to activate, CSR, maybe not in a don't do it kind of context versus like a mitigation context.
Zach, I have a consultant that I can send you to who is absolutely expert at really properly engaging the right people within the kind of corporate engine, if you will, to thread that needle. But I'm curious if others, Brad Walker, do you have some walking insight there?
The group, both the virtual group and the in-person group, will get used to my comments from the back of the room all week.
That's Peter Stein, by the way, folks, Lime Timber.
But actually, I think it should be the kind of person or organization that Leigh alluded to, and maybe a bad cop as well. So I could do the quiet call to Center for Biodiversity if you'd like. So
Careful there.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Could be
To you,
years of
Leigh.
litigation coming your way. But the just for the benefit of folks, Jen Thompson with Ocelot Company used to head up corporate social responsibility and corporate partnerships for the Conservation Fund and now consults. We can think of a couple other folks to send your way as well. All right, let's blast forward. Ballot measures. Walker, I want to punt this one to you since you're presenting on it tomorrow, and you can cover it in one sentence and we can skip on ahead. Your call.
Sure. So we will have a session tomorrow on conservation finance using ballot measures. You may have also heard people talk about initiatives or propositions, when you go to vote and it says, when you see the signs, it says vote yes or vote no on prop, pick a number, 52. Anyway, so we'll be talking about that tomorrow. But in general, we're talking about times when a state, a county, a municipality votes to tax themselves in order to create funding for some form of conservation. We're also seeing instances where that funding is being created, not just for the acquisition of a piece of property, but maybe for more conservation or environmental initiatives broadly. We're also seeing instances where the funding and the mechanism as it is formed in the legislation that backs it up can be very specific. It can say, as this funding is generated, X percentage of it must be used in underserved communities or in parts of the city, the county, the municipality, that are experiencing the effects of blank. So we'll go into that a little bit more, but I will say to close this one out, this one is in scare quotes, relatively simple, relatively straightforward, can produce a lot of funding.
But not relatively easy, which is different than relatively
Correct.
simple.
Very, absolutely correct. And we'll even tell you a story tomorrow of when simple and easy are not the same.
Absolutely. So let's skip examples in the room for this one because we can source that tomorrow in the discussion. Sound good?
Okay, next.
All right. So Bridge Finance will be joined this week by Reggie Hall to learn a bit about this. But for folks who've already had a chance to meet Peter Howell, Reggie says everything he learned about borrowing money, he learned from borrowing it from Peter Howell. So feel free to use Peter as a resource, but effectively, when there's a timeliness to a project or transaction that supersedes the availability of a certain funding source, could be from a foundation, could be from a public entity, you can think about borrowing money. And Bridge finance especially is a very short-term strategy, usually maximum of 1 to 3 years are the terms of those loans. The sources come from banks, foundations, conservation lenders, sometimes individuals, sometimes board members, as the case may be. So it really allows you to strike quickly when you need to time the market a little better, especially for land and resource acquisition. I know that there are a couple borrowers in the room, and we're going to hear a little bit from them during Reggie's session. But do folks just want to introduce themselves and say, like, amount and time of what they've borrowed?
Any volunteers?
I can call on people I know who've borrowed. I know you're in the room.
Got
Sure, we
one
have one.
volunteer. Just a sec, Leigh.
Hi, I'm Nathan Smith from Cassini Environmental in Melbourne, Australia. And we've used bank financing for the majority of our projects to purchase or to acquire land. We typically hold on to projects between 4 to 10 years and then either pay the bank back or recycle the capital again into more projects. The only thing I'd say is that there's a limit to the bank, and I think we've borrowed up to 14 million, wanting to go further, and negotiating at the moment to try and increase the facility because of the amount of contracts we need to fulfill. So it's a tricky one. We're on the cusp of thinking about private equity because whilst the bank is simple, it's also they're also hard to get over the line because they require security and personal guarantees and all that sort of stuff. So we're sort of exploring the equity model at the moment.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have one more.
All right, and this will be our last one, and we'll move on.
Hi, my name is Mike Verts with Propagate. So we're actually trying to put a facility in place now to help finance around a grant that we won through the Climate Smart Commodities Grant. So really a form of construction loan to sort of bridge between sort of the install of an agroforestry system to the receipt of government funds. And then back when I did solar within an affordable housing program, I think it was very important to have a philanthropic bridge finance lender to allow nonprofits to do the construction finance to allow them to actually own their solar systems. So I think we're both with agroforestry partners and previously solar when we did nonprofit work, always looked to philanthropic capital for the bridge financing. So it was lower cost and didn't have to worry about the banks.
Absolutely. Go for simpler and easier money first, right? All right, so we're going to have plenty more time to delve into this topic. Environmental credit markets. So this is the subject of all morning tomorrow, and we will be live streaming, especially the carbon session with a stellar panel lineup. So we'll go lightly on this one because we've got an hour, at least an hour and 15 minutes for it tomorrow. But the important thing to note, this week, we're not covering necessarily the universe of ecosystem services and what ought we to be paying for what nature provides. We're really chiefly focusing in on market-like transactions, so where money is actually exchanging hands. So we'll get into that. Just had to pick on our colleague from the Climate Trust and the example of the Southern Plains Land Trust and Grassland Soil Project here for an example. So you can take up at the break and talk to Travis or tomorrow. T-minus 15 minutes, so I'm going to keep going, folks. Pay for success. So I mentioned that Seth Brown with Quantified Ventures will be joining the course on Thursday. This is a range of strategies that parades by a bunch of different names nowadays. Sometimes this can be outcomes-based financing, performance contracting. In certain instances, these types of projects may be structured as something called an environmental impact bond. But effectively, at the heart of it, it's a contracting model that links payment to project outcomes. So the project developer only receives their payment once that particular outcome is achieved, thereby shifting the risk of performance onto the project developer instead of the payer. So by taking that risk away from the payer, makes some entities a lot more comfortable putting in the money. I wonder if anyone in the room, I know Sophie, you and your Forest Service team have been very involved in some of these projects and transactions with Forest Service partners. I wonder if other folks in the room have had experience with outcomes-based financing, performance contracting.
We got one in the back. Walker's headed over with the mic now.
Hello, Soraya here from Blue Forest. Yes, we are a partner of the Forest Service, and we have a project in Yuba in California where we are supporting the restoration of forest lands and watersheds there, also with WRI. But essentially, we bring in beneficiaries who are interested in increased supply of water, for example, and those benefits then are paid for as they are realized. An example of a beneficiary here is the Yuba Water Agency. So bringing in those water utilities to pay for benefits as they come to fruition.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the risk of that one was shifted, which allowed a lot of the upfront contracting work to get done, correct?
Thumbs up.
Thanks for translating, Walker. All right. Next up, so Peter Stein, that is, feel free to heckle me on this one, but just wanted to note a big chunk of Thursday, especially in the morning, is going to be devoted to demystifying the who, what, where, when, and why of impact investment, which is really an investment made with the intention to generate a measurable social and environmental impact alongside financial return. Those two things in tandem. Sometimes you hear about this as the double or triple bottom line. We see that a lot of the exploding interest in impact investment is driven by a couple of things. One, just the reality of resource scarcity, but moreover, this intergenerational transfer of wealth. $30 trillion is expected to change hands in the coming decades. It's the biggest single intergenerational transfer of wealth that has ever occurred. And the trend line, what we anticipate is that the inheritors of this wealth do care more than their predecessors about social and environmental responsibility. So we're hoping that that continues to trend in our favor. And then just the reality of climate risk. We're seeing lots and lots of money traipsing into climate investments in various capacities. So a lot of exploding interest in the past 10, 15 years. A lot of constraints that make it hard for those of us boots on the ground to access the scale of capital that a lot of impact investors effectively to be able to responsibly manage a check in the order of magnitude that some of the investors want to cut, to be blunt about it. But Peter, anything you want to preview for us before Thursday?
So sure, this is Peter once again, and it's only the first day, but anyway. And I don't get to edit Leigh's slides, but we're going to be talking about the full range of financial return associated with ESG, MRI, impact, and whatever term you want to use for this space. But there is no requirement for a concessionary return. Sometimes those are called mistakes. No, I'm just joking. But there are plenty of impact investment groups who are willing to receive a less than market return, a so-called concessionary return, but there are also plenty of impact investment managers out there that are generating a market return. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, Peter. And there are some examples in the room of groups that have not only partnered with private capital, but in fact, Lime. Care to say just a quick word on what it takes to partner with a private entity?
Sure. An appreciation of a sense of humor would be the first requirement. But I think some of the readiness factors that Leigh alluded to earlier in this presentation, do you have the back office support? Have you done anything like this before? Do you have strong partners to work with? Is there an identifiable source of public or philanthropic dollars that we can count on when we're underwriting. In this case, Lime Timber is underwriting an investment that has an NGO partner or an NGO facilitating the investment. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for.
Absolutely. So we will continue demystifying this bucket, but obviously you're starting to see, if you want to ask some questions about how this works or how to think about it, feel free to, hit Peter, the Stein variety, up at the break. And then really also just thinking about other potential revenue sources, owning and managing what you might own. So we've seen different effectively sources of revenue coming into organizations, some of the more creative ones like billboard fees and things like that. So just a tip to folks to think creatively about what they own and operate. And then really, as we kind of start to wrap things up here, what I would want to argue, and other folks in the room can add their own interpretation to this, but I would say a lot of folks who have transaction experience as an organization are fairly well experienced with blending public and philanthropic funding, maybe even some return-seeking funding. But so thinking about how you're actually stacking and layering philanthropic money, agile money that can move very quickly, often the first money in, the most flexible for sure, with a very strong mission mandate, how that pairs with public money, much more rigid money that moves much more slowly. I just heard about an RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program project that 2 years in had not yet gotten contracted. By the way, have we introduced to the course the concept of the acronym swear jar yet? So what we really want to do is not have folks using too many acronyms this week so that we can really build shared knowledge and understandings. So feel free to call, whether it's me or other presenters or even your fellow attendees out on the use of acronyms, and maybe we'll make them contribute to the acronym swear jar for a round of drinks Thursday night. We'll see. So good thing that I called myself out on my first slip up there. I'll send a little Venmo to Julia and we can get that tip jar started. So also private. Private is picky money. Maybe Peter wouldn't describe himself that way, but picky money. It can move really fast when the stars align, but they have to be pretty perfectly aligned. Far more rigid requirements and expectations associated, and almost entirely finance first, though Peter did mention there are some concessionary people willing to take a less than return. I think we'll keep moving here unless Peter or Brad would like to say something on the tune of blended capital.
Not at the moment, other than with the amount of federal money around, it seems like the opportunities are larger than they've been for a long time.
Absolutely, I 100% agree with that one. So one thing that I just wanted to introduce as we stick it all together, as it were, is a project development support tool that CFN developed, which we hope holds across different types of project models and strategies and tools that we've talked about today. This is based on some assessment research that CFN did back in 2021, looking at the elements needed to effectively implement a conservation finance project. We studied 25 conservation finance innovation grants that had gone through the full kind of project cycle, as it were. And win, lose, or draw, we tried to really interpret by looking through those examples what were the most common elements of success, and where something had not gone to plan, what did that then instruct us on a project development front? And so we developed it into this cute visual arch framework, if you will. It might be the only time in your life that you learn the vocabulary voussoir, which that joke will make more sense if you ever do read the Arch Framework report, or if you already have leafed through it from the read aheads and resources Google Doc. But effectively, the two key elements, and you can see this, the quote unquote springers, the bottom and most critical elements of the arch, are really starting with the problem that you're trying to solve and the payers who are willing and able to pay for the solution. Once you have those two things laser sharp in place, then you can start to build the project by using effective and implementable practices. Do the practices exist? Have they been proven? Have they been tested? Co-creating that solution with core constituents we found to be very key, very important. So you're not just bringing a particular solution to a landscape or a community, but you're actually engaging the most critical core constituents, if you will, in that co-creation process. Sometimes it might be your partners. Sometimes it might be the on-the-ground stakeholders. Certainly, and you'd be surprised at how many people missed this one in their project implementation for their CIG projects, but making sure that you were aligned with legal policy and regulatory conditions. Some projects had a really, really strong project strategy, but it just didn't work from a legal perspective. And unfortunately, a lot of money goes into finding out that something doesn't work after the fact. Measuring and managing data. This goes back to some of those elements of project readiness. Is your back of the office in place? Do you have the systems and processes to actually measure and manage data appropriately relative to the type of project that you're working to advance? And then partners is really the keystone, we felt, bringing the right set of people to take the work from concept through to scale, through from pilot on to scale. So also thinking about our ground rules for the week. You don't have to be the expert, but you do need to make sure that you're working with really good partners. So lots more to cover if you get into the report. It's really meant to help be a tool to help guide various stages of project development. And so we invite you to check that out if you haven't already. And then jump in for more. So Julia and Mary will be sharing later this week, but CFN is really here to serve as a resource to you all. We have a monthly e-news where we try and distill a lot of the kind of insight that you're hearing over the course of this presentation and week. Hopefully folks have stumbled upon some of the conservation books and titles that we recommended. Certainly Bill Ginn's Investing in Nature or Story Clark's Field Guide to Conservation Finance are two good ones to start with, especially Stories if you're coming from more of a land trust background, and perhaps Bill's if you're coming more from a project development, and especially thinking about more innovative and larger projects and transactions. Like this session is live streamed and recorded, we also have a whole bevy and library of resources to help, and then just a whole lot more. So I don't want to steal Mary and Julia's thunder, but that's it from my end. And we can take any questions or open it up for the couple of minutes that we have left.
So we have time for a question or two, and then we'll have a break. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Coral Edgington, and I'm from the U.S. Army Environmental Command. So this might be a multi-part question that we'll probably have to have through discussions in the room, but I guess I kind of represent the federal funding side of the house realistically. And so there were a couple comments throughout the presentation talking about how sometimes the federal funds can be difficult to leverage. They're not the easiest and quickest form of money, and sometimes they take too long. So I'd really like to get an idea of what can we do, not from a perception, but a practice standpoint, to help reduce that constraint or that perception of constraint on federal funds and how easy they are to use. I'm specifically speaking from the DoD source, but there's a lot of other federal funders in the room.
Can we turn that to, well, we have a Peter Stein. And then if you have it from your experience, if you have a suggestion or response, we'll hear from you next.
I think it's a great opening to begin to talk about this. We'll go into it. Alan Front is one of the presenters who's deeply knowledgeable. I would argue that for better or for worse, DoD and REPI is the sort of outside speediest federal funding source. And And if you are working with the Department of Interior, any of the 4 federal agencies that are within that department, they have this you can quote me, nightmare appraisal process that takes between 2 and 3 years to complete. So that's an example of a lot of money, meaning the doubling of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and money that came from the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act that goes to DOI agencies, but they still have to take quite a number of years to, even for approved projects, to get the money actually to the nonprofit partner or the landowner or whoever is the correct recipient for those dollars. And that's why we have a session on bridge financing. So I wish it could get better. If any of you are having trouble falling asleep, there's a 120-page report written by the Environmental Policy Innovation Center about making federal land transactions more efficient. Came out 3 months ago. Actually, you can read the first 20 pages. It's enough. If you read beyond that, you will fall asleep, but it's a great report. Lime Timber actually was a partner on that project. And it'll begin to explore some of the issues that you just brought up.
Leigh, we have one more hand raised.
I'll give one example. So this is Libby Kamalo from World Wildlife Fund, also working with Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Alliance in the Northern Great Plains. I have a Native Nation partner, I won't mention specific tribe. Just as an example, they have been promised funding for 2 years from Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, and are still waiting for the money. And that is linked to staffing turnover and loss of staff. So I believe there was a actual effort to reduce staff in one of the previous administrations. So not enough staff on the ground to implement and carry out the funding is a huge issue. That's one of many that we run into with federal agencies.
Thank you.
Leigh, do you want to take one more?
Sure. We're just eating into your break, so you guys let me know when folks are getting antsy.
Well, I'll be very brief. But a simplistic barrier that we have is you can't apply for quite a lot of the federal grant funding if you're a private company. You have to be either a public sector entity or a 501c3, which is fine. We find the partners to be able to get projects out there, but doesn't feel like it recognizes the full potential. And again, kind of forces projects to look a certain way that may reduce innovation or efficiency in other parts of it.
Absolutely. Any comments or follow-up? Peter, you're more familiar with that context.
I don't know. Can you see the slide that's being portrayed right now?
The welcome slide?
Yeah, with the dinner in Fort
For
Collins.
Collins?
Yeah, can you describe what happened about 5 minutes after this slide was taken?
Oh, well, it looks quite lovely, but then the skies opened up and we all ducked and covered for torrential rainstorm. Then we came back in between rainstorms to quickly try and finish our dinner before another rainstorm came. And I guess we got rewarded with a nice sunset. Do you have something else in mind there, Peter?
Yeah, did you tap into federal funds, Peter?
Leigh, any final words?
Let's see. We haven't gotten, I'm looking for some questions from the chat. We did get a request for the Environmental Policy Innovation Center report, so we can share that with folks. We'll add it to the read aheads and resources documents if it's not already there. I think it might already be there, but we can double check. So Kim online with Tetons, we'll make sure to get that in the read aheads and resources, which will be updated frequently throughout the week.
Okay, this was the 101 session, the beginning. We'll come back at 3 o'clock